They ordered her to drop all weapons. She smiled and said, "I don't use them anyway." The first thing Sarah Voss noticed was that her hands were free, not unrestrained. The cuffs around her wrists were real, solid metal, locked tight enough to leave marks. But her hands were in front of her body, not behind it. That was the kind of mistake you only made if you had never met anyone who studied how restraints actually worked. She filed that away and looked around the room. The cell was roughly 4 meters by 4 meters. Gray walls, no seams she could find, no visible hinges on the door. A single light strip ran across the ceiling, casting white light with no shadows. The floor had a faint hum she could feel through the soles of her boots, the deep mechanical vibration of a very large ship running at full power. The air smelled like recycled oxygen and something metallic underneath it, like the inside of an old vent system that had been sealed for a long time. She had been awake for 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes she had counted the ceiling tiles, tested the tensile strength of the cuffs by pressing them against the edge of the bench she was sitting on, identified the location of the room's ventilation intake by watching which way the dust moved near the floor, and noted that the door had no seam at the bottom, which meant it was pressure sealed rather than hinged. Much harder to force, but easier to unlock from the outside with a standard atmospheric release. She was a xenobiologist and a linguist. She had a doctorate in alien communication systems from the University of Edinburgh, a secondary qualification in structural xenoarchitecture, and 11 years of field experience across 14 star systems. She had spent 2 of those years studying the Cathara Dominion from the outside, their language patterns, their military communication signals, their biological classifications. She had never expected to study them from the inside. The endurance was gone. She knew that. She had watched it break apart through the viewport of the escape pod before the pod's hull had been swallowed by something she still could not fully calculate, a docking mechanism, maybe, or something purpose-built to collect smaller vessels, the way a net collects fish. The last transmission she had received from Captain Owen Cole was 4 words: "Get to the pods." She had. She did not know if anyone else had. The door opened without a sound. 3 beings entered the room. They were tall, nearly 2 meters each, with the segmented body structure that all her research confirmed as Cathara standard, though she had never seen one in person before this moment. Smooth, dark exoskeletal plating, 4-jointed limbs, and optical sensors mounted in clusters on the upper portion of the head where a human's eyes would be. They moved in perfect synchronization, a precision that was either trained or instinctive, and they took up positions around the room with the ease of beings who had done this 1,000 times. Behind them came a 4th, different from the first 3 in every way that mattered, taller, older, if the worn texture of the exoskeletal plating meant what she thought it meant. The cluster of optical sensors on the upper head had a slight asymmetry, as though where one side had sustained damage at some point and healed imperfectly. It moved more slowly than the others, not because it was weaker, but because slowness was a choice it had made long ago and kept making. The way a confident person never rushes through a room. It stopped in front of her, 3 meters away. It looked at her for a full 10 seconds without speaking. Sarah looked back. Then a small device on its belt produced a sound, and the sound resolved into words, a translation system. The language it spoke in was not English. She recognized the underlying phonemic structure as early Cathara military dialect, which she had studied from intercepted signals, but the translation was clean, almost native in quality. "Identify yourself and the purpose of your vessel's presence in this sector," it said. "You are currently in the custody of Commander Dreth of the Cathara Dominion 7th Acquisitions Fleet. Non-compliance with this directive will be interpreted as hostile intent." Sarah looked at the commander. She looked at the 3 guards. She looked at the translation device on his belt, which was a model she recognized from a communications study published 3 years ago. She had read the paper twice. Then she looked back at the commander and said, in the clearest Cathara military dialect she could produce, "I think there has been a miscalculation on your part. You have the wrong ship." The room went very quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of 4 beings who had just heard something unexpected and needed a moment to process it. The 3 guards exchanged a micro-adjustment of their optical sensors. Not a look exactly, but a communication of something. The commander's cluster of sensors focused on her with an intensity she could feel. "You speak our language," the commander said, through his own mouth this time, not through the translation device. "I speak 41 languages," Sarah said, still in Cathara military dialect. "Yours was not the hardest. Your phonemic inventory is actually quite manageable once you get past the trilled fricatives. The hard part was the tonal shift system in the verb structure. I spent 8 months on that alone. Another silence. Longer this time. The Endurance, the commander said, was a military survey vessel registered to Earth Command. It was a scientific survey vessel, Sarah said, registered to the Interplanetary Research Consortium, with a secondary attachment to Earth Command for navigation clearance in outer sectors. There is a significant legal difference, under your own Dominion's acquisition protocols, between a military asset and a scientific one. I can cite the relevant statute if that would help. She said this pleasantly, not aggressively, not with the trembling effort of someone performing bravery. Just the way you say a true thing to a reasonable person and expect them to update. Accordingly, the commander looked at her for a very long moment. You will surrender any weapons on your person, it said. Of course. Sarah held up her cuffed hands, though I should point out that I do not have any. I am a scientist. I study things. Weapons would imply a different professional orientation. The commander reached forward and activated the release mechanism on the cuffs. They fell away from her wrists. She noticed that too. He had chosen to do it himself, rather than signaling one of the guards. That was information. You will come with us, the commander said. I would be glad to, Sarah said, and stood up and followed him out the door, and spent the entire walk down the corridor, learning everything she could about the ship she was now inside. It was very large. Larger than she had calculated from the sensor data she had seen. The Endurance's instruments had captured the outer hull dimensions, but walking through the interior corridors gave her the vertical scale, in a way that numbers on a screen never quite communicated. The ceiling was 4 meters high in the walkways. The structural supports were spaced at intervals that suggested an internal compartmentalization, system designed to maintain pressure integrity in the event of multiple hull breaches simultaneously. The floor plates had a magnetic texture she could feel through her boots, which meant artificial gravity was supplemented rather than generated exclusively by the ship's own rotation, which in turn meant a power plant of significant scale. She counted the crew she saw in the corridors, 17 in the first section, 11 in the second. The distribution was uneven in ways that suggested shift changes rather than permanent assignment, which was a detail she would need later. The commander walked 3 paces ahead of her. The 3 guards had reconfigured, one ahead, one behind, one to her left. The position to her right was unguarded, which she would have assumed was an oversight until she noticed the commander himself was positioned exactly there, between her and the right wall. He was covering the gap himself, deliberate then. He wanted to be the one within reach of her. That told her something important about how he thought. They brought her to a larger room, a briefing room, judging by the configuration of surfaces and the quality of lighting, designed for extended conversation rather than containment. The commander dismissed 2 of the guards, keeping only one, and sat across a surface from her with the translation device placed between them on the table. You claim to be a scientist, he said. I am a scientist, she said. The claim part is just the version of that statement I offer to people who do not yet have enough information to evaluate it. What were you studying in this sector? Communication patterns, she said. Specifically, the way signal transmissions from your outer fleet installations interact with naturally occurring electromagnetic interference from the pulsar cluster at grid reference 77 Delta. I had 18 months of longitudinal data. It was going to be a very good paper. You were studying us, the commander said. I was studying signals, she said. Signals that happen to originate from your installations. There is a difference. A linguist studying a conversation between 2 strangers on a public walkway is not surveilling anyone. They are doing linguistics. The commander was quiet for a while. She let the silence stay. She had learned, across 11 years of contact work with 17 non-human species, that silence was only uncomfortable for the side that felt pressure to fill it. She did not feel that pressure. You are not afraid, the commander said finally. I am cautious, she said. Fear and caution produce similar behaviors but come from different places. Fear makes you reactive. Caution makes you deliberate. I try to stay on the deliberate side. We have destroyed your ship. You have recovered it, she said. There is a difference there, too. The Endurance had significant research data aboard, 18 months of signal pattern analysis, a biological survey of 3 uncharted systems, and a set of acoustic recordings from a gas giant formation that I suspect will rewrite our understanding of large-body atmospheric acoustics. If you had simply destroyed it, that data would be gone. But you didn't, did you? You brought the ship in intact. You collect information. So do I. I think that is worth noting. The commander's optical sensors settled on her with a quality she had learned to recognize over 11 years of reading non-human attention as something close to reassessment. You will be placed in a holding area while your status is determined, he said. Understood, she said. Could I make one request? He waited. A window, she said. Or any kind of viewport. I would like to see where I am. The commander looked at her for a moment. Then he said something to the guard in rapid-fire Kethera that she caught only half of. The word for viewport was in there, and something that might have been the word for evaluation, and something that was definitely the word for unusual. She noted that too. The room they put her in had a viewport. It was small, 20 centimeters across, and set into the wall at an angle that required her to stand on the edge of the sleeping platform to see through it properly. But through it she could see the stars, and the curve of a planet she did not recognize, and in the far distance a cluster of 5 other vessels in formation. She memorized their configuration, their relative positions, the angle of their approach vectors. Then she sat down on the sleeping platform, folded her hands in her lap, and began, very carefully and very systematically, to think. She did not know how long she would be here. She did not know how many crew members were on this ship, or what the commander's authority structure was, or whether anyone from the Endurance had survived. She did not know if Earth Command had any idea what had happened to them, or if a rescue was even a concept being considered. What she knew was this: she was alive. She was inside the most sophisticated piece of Kethara engineering she had ever encountered. She spoke their language, and no one on this ship had yet thought to ask how she had learned it. That was a significant oversight. She intended to be patient about it. They gave her 3 days before anyone came back. 3 days of the small viewport, the sleeping platform, meals delivered through a slot in the door, and the steady hum of the ship's engines. She used all of it. She mapped the ship through sound and vibration. The engine frequency told her the drive configuration. The pressure variations in the ventilation told her the ship's internal compartment layout. Each time a bulkhead sealed elsewhere in the vessel, the airflow in her cell shifted by a fraction, and she tracked every shift. By the end of the first day, she had a rough schematic of 3 full decks in her head, built entirely from listening. She mapped the crew through timing. Meal deliveries came at precise intervals, which told her the ship operated on a strict duty rotation. The acoustics in the corridor outside her door were clear enough that she could count footsteps. Lone patrols every 40 minutes. Paired patrols every 2 hours, which suggested a standard military watch system adapted for this vessel's size. She estimated a crew of somewhere between 80 and 120, based on the corridor traffic density and the timing intervals. She worked on the language during the quiet hours. Her Kethara was already strong, but the dialect aboard this ship was a specific variant. There were phonemic markers in the crew's speech patterns that she could hear through the door during patrol passes, micro-variations in the fricative sounds that indicated a regional formation she had not encountered in any of her research materials. She cataloged each variant she heard and cross-referenced it against what she already knew, building a more precise map of how language functioned on this ship, which would tell her things about crew composition and origin that she could not get any other way. On the second day, she found the ventilation access panel. She was not looking for it specifically. She was doing what she always did in any enclosed space, which was run her hands methodically along every surface with her eyes closed, feeling for irregularities. Scientists who work in alien environments develop this habit out of necessity. In a space you do not fully understand, your other senses are often more useful than your eyes, because your eyes have been trained to find things that look relevant to a human, and alien engineering does not always look relevant to a human. The panel was behind the sleeping platform, at floor level 20 centimeters square, with a release mechanism that required simultaneous pressure at 2 specific points. She found the pressure points by accident. She was bracing herself against the wall while reaching toward something under the platform, and both her palm and her elbow made contact at the exact right positions at the same time. The panel popped open with a soft click. She looked inside, a maintenance crawl space, roughly 60 centimeters in diameter, running horizontally into the wall and then, based on the air movement she could feel, turning to run vertically at some point not far ahead. The air coming through it was different from the recycled air in her cell, slightly cooler, with an electrical charge to it that suggested proximity to active systems. She did not go in. Not yet. She resealed the panel, moved the platform back to its exact original position, and sat down. Not yet. The commander came on the third day. He came alone, which surprised her. He carried no weapon she could see, which surprised her more. He sat down on the only other surface in the room, a small fixture bolted to the wall across from her sleeping platform, and he placed the translation device on his knee. and he looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "You said my vessel has made a miscalculation," he said. "I have spent 2 days reviewing your claim." "And," she said, "the Interplanetary Research Consortium is a real organization," he said. "The secondary attachment to Earth Command is a standard administrative arrangement for all scientific vessels operating in outer sectors. The Endurance's classification as a scientific survey vessel is technically accurate." "Yes," she said, "but you were in a restricted corridor," he said. "This sector is designated under Dominion Expansion Protocol as a closed zone. The entry of any non-Cathera vessel, regardless of classification, constitutes a violation of territorial authority. I was outside the boundary marker by 3 weeks of travel time," she said. "I have the navigation logs from the Endurance to prove it, or I did. You may have those now, if your technical team has accessed the ship's data core. I would suggest looking at the timestamp on the 3rd navigation entry after our last system jump. That will show our position relative to the boundary at the time of contact." The commander looked at her. "You know what my technical team found," he said. "I know what should be on those logs," she said. "Whether your team has found it yet is a different question. The Endurance ran a non-standard data organization system. I designed part of it myself. It is not immediately intuitive from the outside." "You designed part of your own ship's data system," he said. "I was bored during the transit between the 4th and 5th survey points," she said. 42 days of deep space travel with no interesting signal data coming in. You either find something to do or you slowly lose your mind. I reorganized 3 databases and learned to play an instrument." The commander was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What instrument?" She had not expected that question. It was the first question he had asked that was not directly related to the situation at hand. She noted its significance immediately. "A Terran string instrument called a cello," she said. "I am not very good. My hands are the wrong shape for it. But the process of learning something difficult is worth more than the result, usually." The commander looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "I am going to ask you a question and I want you to answer it without the framing. You have been using since you arrived here." She said nothing. She waited. "Why does a xenobiologist and a linguist spend 8 months learning the tonal shift system in Cathara military verb structure?" he said. "We do not publish language resources. We do not make our communication systems available for external study. The only way to learn what you know is from intercepted signals. How long have your people been listening to us?" She considered this for a moment. It was a fair question. It deserved a fair answer. "Earth Command began intercepting Cathera signals approximately 19 years ago," she said. "The first linguists assigned to the translation project made almost no progress for the first 4 years, because they were attempting to apply a phonemic framework developed for a different class of alien communication system. I was brought in as a secondary consultant 8 years ago with a specific brief to approach the language from a structural, rather than a phonemic, starting point. I made the first real breakthrough in the tonal verb system 14 months later. Since then, a team of 6 has developed the grammar to a point where field-level operational communication is possible." The commander listened to all of this without moving. "You are telling me this freely," he said. "You already knew we had been listening," she said. "Any intelligent civilization knows that a neighbor capable of interstellar travel is also capable of signal interception. The only question was whether we had made enough progress to be useful. Now you know the answer to that question. What you do not know is what we did with the information, and that I am not going to tell you freely." The commander stood up. He picked up the translation device from his knee and looked at it for a moment, then looked back at her. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" she asked. "A pilot or an engineer," he said. "Someone with operational training." "I have operational training," she said. "I have spent 11 years in field environments that would be fatal to someone without it. I simply do not advertise it, because people who know you can handle yourself are less likely to be careless around you. And I prefer people to be careless around me." The commander put the translation device back on his belt and turned to leave. "Commander," she said. He stopped. "The navigation logs I mentioned," she said. "Entry 3 after the last system jump. The timestamp places us well outside the closed zone. If there is a review process for acquisitions that turn out to be misclassified, those logs are the relevant evidence. I am mentioning it not because I expect it to change your immediate decision, but because I expect you are the kind of officer who does not enjoy being wrong in ways that become visible later." She had no idea if that was true. She was betting on it based on the fact that he had come alone, without a weapon, and had asked her a question about a musical instrument. The commander left without responding. The door sealed behind him. She waited 10 minutes. Then she moved the sleeping platform and opened the ventilation recess panel and looked inside again. The air current was coming from the left. That meant the vertical shaft, when she reached it, would be running upward rather than down. She lay flat on the floor and looked in as far as she could see. 3 meters of horizontal crawl space before a right-angle turn. The interior surface was smooth and uniform. No motion sensors that she could detect from here. No visible light sources. She sealed the panel and put the platform back. Not yet. She needed to know 3 more things before she went anywhere. She needed to know where the ship's communication array was located relative to her current position. She needed to know the crew rotation schedule in enough detail to predict the 2 longest consecutive gaps in corridor traffic. And she needed to know whether anyone else from the Endurance was alive and aboard this vessel. She had identified 2 of the 3 from sound and vibration alone. The communication array was almost certainly 2 decks up and forward, based on the signal interference patterns she had noted in the ventilation air on the days when the ship was actively transmitting. She could feel the electromagnetic resonance in the metal of the walls. The crew rotation gaps were in the early morning of what the ship's lighting system suggested was the local day cycle, a window of approximately 22 minutes between the end of the night watch and the beginning of the day shift, when corridor traffic dropped to almost nothing. The third thing, whether anyone else had survived, she could not determine from her cell. That was the one that kept her awake. She had been on the Endurance with 11 other people: Captain Cole, the navigation officer, a quiet man named Peter Aldrich, who had told the best stories during long transits and made coffee so strong it left a ring in the cup when you were done. The engineer, Donna Fraser, who had a laugh that carried through 3 bulkheads and could fix any electrical system built in the last 40 years with parts from a different electrical system built in a completely different decade. 8 others, each of whom she could list by name, by specialty, by the specific way they moved through the corridors of the Endurance. She did not know if any of them were alive. She could not let that question stop her. She knew that, but it sat in the back of her working mind like a frequency she could not quite tune out, present in everything she was doing, coloring every calculation. She lay down on the sleeping platform and closed her eyes and went through the ship, schematic she had built from vibration and sound, refining it, correcting the estimates where she had new data from the commander's visit, extending it into the areas she had not yet been able to map. She thought about the ventilation panel. She thought about the communication array. She thought about 22 minutes. She thought about Peter Aldrich and Donna Fraser and Captain Cole and 8 other people she did not know the fate of. Then she stopped thinking about what she could not change and went back to thinking about what she could. There was work to do. There was always work to do. She had spent her entire career finding that fact to be more comforting than most people expected it to be. She started planning. She spent the 3rd evening doing something she had not allowed herself to do since she arrived. She thought specifically and carefully about Peter Aldrich. Peter was the Endurance's chief navigation officer. He was 38 years old, from a small city in coastal Wales, and he had a habit of telling very long stories during deep space transits that somehow always ended in the same place: a specific pub in the harbor town where he grew up, and a specific argument his father had won over a specific game of cards. A story that changed in the telling but always arrived at the same destination, with the same quality of warmth, the warmth of a person who returns to a memory, because the memory is genuinely good rather than because it is the only good memory available. He made coffee so strong it left a visible ring inside the cup when you finished it. He could navigate by dead reckoning through a sector he had never visited before using nothing but elapsed time and velocity calculations, a skill he had developed during his first assignment and considered completely standard, which it was not. She did not know if Peter was alive. She allowed herself to think about that for exactly 20 minutes by the count of her watch. She had learned, over many years of field work in difficult situations, that suppressing this kind of thinking entirely was counterproductive. The mind would find it, anyway, at the worst possible moment, and the redirection of attention required to manage an unexpected intrusion of grief or fear was more costly, in terms of focus, than a deliberate and time-limited engagement with the difficult material. 20 minutes. She thought about Peter, and the coffee, and the story about the cards game, and she thought about the other 8 people she did not know the fate of, and she felt what she felt about that. Then she wound her watch and went back to work. The administrative terminal was accessible to all 4 of them, which the commander had either not thought through or had decided was acceptable given the access level restriction. She went back to it after Owen and Ren were asleep and spent 3 more hours in the secondary layer of its data structure, building a more detailed picture of the ship's communication systems. The aft relay's position was confirmed on the ship's internal schematic, one deck directly below their current room, accessible through the ventilation system she had not yet fully mapped in this section. The relay's operating schedule showed it was unstaffed during the same transition gap that created the quiet window in the corridors. 18 minutes, early morning, between the night watch and the day shift. 16 minutes, the commander had told her. The vibration timing lagged 2 minutes. She had not known, when she read those 18 minutes in the terminal's data, that she was going to receive that correction from the commander himself. The correction changed her calculation meaningfully. 2 minutes less in a 16-minute window was a 12.5% reduction in available time, which mattered in an operation where the timing was already tight. But the commander had given her the accurate number, which meant she could plan to the accurate number, rather than to an estimate that was wrong in a specific direction. The accuracy was worth more than the additional 2 minutes would have been. She thought about why he had told her. She had been thinking about that since the afternoon conversation, turning it around in her mind the way you turn an object in your hands when you are trying to understand its shape by feel rather than by sight. He had told her the accurate transition window. He had told her the correct ventilation route. He had given her the authentication code. He had done all of this after she had been straightforwardly honest with him about what she intended to use the code for. The model she had been building of Commander Dreth over the past 2 weeks was a model of a specific kind of mind, one that processed the world in terms of operational accuracy, that valued reliable information over convenient information, and that made decisions based on a clear-eyed assessment of what was actually true, rather than what was expected to be true by the protocols of the situation he was in. She had seen that quality in the first interview, when he had come alone and without a weapon. She had confirmed it in the second interview, when he had given her the code and the route and the corrected timing. The question she kept returning to was whether that quality was specific to Commander Dreth, or whether it was more widely distributed within Cathara, command structure than her 8 years of external study had suggested. If it was specific to him, she had been lucky. If it was more widely distributed, she had been right about something significant, and the implications of being right about something significant in this context were worth thinking about carefully. She sat with that question in the small hours of the morning, while Owen and Ren slept, and Donna maintained her quiet watchfulness against the wall, and she did what she always did with questions that had no immediate answer. She held them open, clearly without forcing a resolution, and she waited to see what evidence arrived to address them. Evidence had a way of arriving if you left the question open long enough. On the 5th day they moved her. She had not expected it on the 5th day. She had expected it on the 6th or 7th, based on what she had learned about the ship's administrative cycle from the pattern of ventilation pressure changes that accompanied large-scale system processing operations, the kind that happened when crew rosters and resource allocations were updated. Administrative review cycles suggested a 7-day rhythm. She had been working to that timeline. The 5th day threw her calculations off by 2 days. She did not let it show. They took her to a different part of the ship, deeper inside it, 2 decks down, based on the number of stairwell sections they passed through, and significantly further toward the stern, based on the increase in engine vibration frequency under her feet. The new room was larger than the first, but it was not empty. There were 3 other people in it, human people. She stopped in the doorway when she saw them. The guard behind her applied a brief pressure to her shoulder, not rough, just directional. And she moved forward and heard the door seal behind her. The 3 people stood up when she entered. The tallest was a woman her own age, mid-30s, with close-cropped dark hair and a bruise along her left jaw that was 2 days old at minimum. She was wearing the same base-layer transit suit that all Endurance crew wore under their operational gear. Gray, standard issue, the kind that looked identical on everyone. "Sarah," the woman said. Sarah recognized her voice before her face fully resolved. "Donna," she said. Donna Fraser as her crossed the room in 3 strides, and the 2 of them stood with their hands gripping each other's forearms in the way people do when a handshake is not enough and an embrace feels too much like relief to be quite safe yet. "Who else?" Sarah said. "Use 3, Donna said. "Ren Nakamura from engineering, and Owen." Captain Owen Cole was sitting on the floor in the far corner of the room, his back against the wall and his eyes on the ceiling. He was a tall man, lean, with gray at his temples that had been gray for as long as Sarah had known him. He looked at her when she said his name, and the look told her everything she needed to know about the past 5 days. The others? She said. I don't know, Donna said. I haven't seen anyone else. The pods launched. I watched 6 of them go before mine cleared the bay. But I was the first one here, and I've been in these rooms since I arrived. Ren Nakamura was standing slightly apart, watching the door. He was the youngest person on the Endurance crew, 26, a junior engineer, 3 months into his first deep space assignment. He was standing with his arms crossed and his weight on the balls of his feet, the posture of someone who has been on edge for 5 days and has run out of the capacity to not be on edge. They haven't told you anything, Sarah said. Not a word, Donna said. They bring food. They don't speak. The ones who escorted me here, I tried to communicate 3 times and got nothing back each time. They speak English, Sarah said. Some of them. The commander of this ship is fluent. He has a translation device as well, a model I recognized. They have been in contact with human communications long enough to develop translation technology, which means they have intercepted and processed a significant volume of our transmissions. Owen spoke from the corner. You talked to the commander. At length, she said. On day 3, he looked at her. And I learned some things that I needed to learn, she said. The ship's configuration, the crew rotation, the location of the communication array. She paused. And I learned that the commander is someone who comes to interviews alone and without a weapon. Which means something. What does it mean? He said. She looked at him. He was frightened, but he was holding it together with the kind of determination that very young people in very bad situations sometimes produce. The determination of someone who will not let themselves fall apart because they have decided falling apart is not an option available to them. She respected that. It means he is interested in what I can tell him, she said. Which means we have something to negotiate with. The Cathara Dominion operates under an expansion acquisition protocol. It is a formal legal framework. There are classifications within it. Scientific vessels are classified differently from military ones. We have been classified incorrectly. If we can establish the correct classification through their own review process, our situation changes. By how much? Donna asked. Enough, Sarah said. I need to get to the communication array. I need 2 days and approximately 22 minutes of unmonitored corridor access. And I need the ship's data access codes, which I believe I can obtain through the administrative terminal in this room. She looked at the terminal mounted on the wall near the door, a standard Cathara administrative interface. The same model used on their outer fleet installations based on the signal analysis she had done over the past 8 years. Donna, I need your help with the engineering side of this. Donna looked at the terminal. I do not read Cathara, she said. You do not need to. Sarah said, I need your hands. The input interfaces on Cathara administrative terminals require pressure calibration. They are designed for the limb structure of Cathara crew, which is different from ours in 3 specific joint positions. I can read the interface, but I cannot produce the correct input geometry alone. With 2 people, we can approximate the right configuration. Donna looked at her. You have been in a cell by yourself for 5 days, and you have worked out how to operate their computers. I have been thinking about it for 5 days, Sarah said. There is a difference. I still need to test several assumptions. She crossed to the terminal. Up close, it was exactly what she had expected. A flat input surface with raised contact points arranged in a pattern that matched the 4-digit limb structure of a Cathara hand, requiring simultaneous pressure at multiple points in a specific sequence. She had studied the input protocols from signal analysis of Cathara administrative transmissions, and she had developed a theory about the access sequence. The theory was correct on the 4th attempt. The terminal lit up. What is it showing? Donna said, looking over her shoulder. Crew manifest, Sarah said. Partial access. The administrative level I have reached is read-only on personnel files. She navigated through the interface, reading the Cathara text at a speed that came from 8 years of study. 984 crew members on this vessel. 3 shifts, staggered at 4-hour intervals. The early morning changeover creates a gap of 18 minutes in the aft corridor sections, 16 minutes shorter than I estimated from vibration data alone. That's a narrow window, Donna said. It is workable, Sarah said. She kept reading. Ship designation, Dominion 7th Acquisitions Vessel Kareth Nam. Vessel class, medium interdiction cruiser, designed for outer sector acquisition and transfer operations. Not a warship, not a colony ship, a collection vessel. She paused. They bring things back. This is what they do. They find assets in uncontrolled sectors, and they bring them back to Dominion space for classification and allocation. And what gets allocated as what? Owen said from the corner. She was quiet for a moment. She had found the allocation categories in the terminal's data structure. and she was reading them carefully before she answered. There were 6 categories. 4 of them were material classifications, equipment, technology raw resources, and data assets. The 5th was biological, living non-Cathara specimens classified by complexity. The 6th was what the Cathara records referred to as functional specialists. She knew enough Cathara legal and administrative language to understand what functional specialist meant. It meant people with skills the Dominion considered useful. "We are going to be evaluated," she said. "The process takes approximately 30 Dominion days from point of acquisition. After that, a classification board determines what category we fall into and what happens to us." 30 days, Owen said. He finally stood up from the corner. He was watching her with the expression he used when he was doing the mathematics of a problem and had not yet finished the calculation. "Can you get us out of here in 30 days? "I can get us out of here in 8, she said. "Possibly 6. Owen Cole had been a captain for 14 years. He had the quality that good captains develop over many years in command, which is the ability to hear an extraordinary claim from someone they trust and respond to it with practical questions, rather than doubt. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Time with the terminal," she said. "The access codes for the Endurance's data core, which I believe you have memorized, and your complete trust in a plan that I am going to explain to you in stages as each stage becomes safe to act on." "Why in stages?" Wren said. She looked at him. "Because the only thing more dangerous than a plan that fails is a plan that gets overheard before. It has a chance to fail on its own terms." She glanced at the ceiling, at the walls, at the seams around the doorframe. She did not see any surveillance hardware, but absence of visible hardware was not the same as absence of surveillance. "We speak carefully from here on. We treat every surface in this room as a potential listener, and we do what people in our position are expected to do, which is look frightened and confused and entirely unresourceful." Donna looked at her steadily. "Are you frightened?" she said. Sarah considered the question honestly. She was a person who valued precision in language, including in conversations with herself. "I am aware of the stakes," she said. That is the honest version of the answer. Fear and awareness of stakes produce similar physiological responses, but they are not the same thing, and the difference matters in terms of how clearly you can think. She went back to the terminal. She had 8 days. She intended to use every hour of them. The access codes for the Endurance's data core came from Owen in a low voice, delivered as a string of phonetic references to locations on the ship that only crew members would understand. A system he had devised for exactly this kind of situation, the kind of situation he had hoped would never occur. She input them through the terminal's interface and gained a secondary level of access that connected her to the Endurance's stored data across the docking link the Cathara ship maintained with the captured vessel. 18 months of research data, signal analysis, biological surveys, acoustic recordings, navigation logs, all of it intact, and buried within the navigation logs, in the timestamp data she had told the commander to look for, the exact positional record that proved the Endurance had been in uncontrolled space, rather than closed territory at the time of contact. She copied it to the terminal's accessible memory. Then she started working on the next layer of the problem. The communication array was 2 decks up and 40 meters forward. She knew its position from the electromagnetic resonance she had felt in the walls of her first cell, now confirmed by the ship's schematic visible in the terminal's map database. She could access it through the ventilation system. The crawl space in her first cell was gone now, but the equivalent in this room was there too. She had found it within 12 minutes of arriving, and the routing was more direct from this location. The array itself would be staffed during active transmission hours, unstaffed during the gap between the night watch and the day shift. 16 minutes, not 18. She had revised the estimate downward. She looked at the communication array's technical specifications in the terminal's maintenance database. The array was a dual-function system, capable of both transmission and signal capture. If she could access the transmission function for a minimum of 90 seconds, she could send a compressed burst on the Earth Command emergency frequency. She had never needed to do that before. She had the protocol memorized from her pre-deployment briefing, the way you memorize the evacuation routes of a building. You hope you will never have to evacuate through 90 seconds in 16 minutes. That was the calculation. She started working out how to make it work. The process of building the data packet took most of the 7th day and all of the 7th night. Donna was the one who made it possible. The chip construction, pulling 3 specific microcomponents from the administrative terminal's interface layer, reconfiguring their function through a process that Donna described as technically inadvisable and practically necessary, and combining them into a storage medium that could survive the transfer through the aft relay's secondary port, was engineering work, precise and patient, the kind that requires hands that know how materials behave under specific conditions and a mind that knows which rules of construction can be bent and which ones will simply break the thing you are building if you try. Sarah could do many things. She could not do that. She watched Donna work and she learned what she could. She handed tools, the repurposed edge of a tray fork, the insulated backing from one of the terminal's exposed interface nodes, a small length of conductive thread she had pulled from the seam of her base layer suit. She maintained the timing watch on the terminal, tracking the crew rotation, noting each time the footsteps in the corridor outside their door indicated a patrol pass. She talked Donna through the technical specifications of the aft relay's data port, which she had in her head from the maintenance database she had read through the terminal, and Donna translated those specifications into decisions about which components needed to be configured how. Owen and Ren moved around them quietly, staying out of the way with the practiced ease of people who have spent enough time working in close quarters to know when the most useful thing they can do is give space. The chip came together at approximately 3 in the morning by her watch. Donna held it up between 2 fingers and looked at it with the expression she used when something had worked out the way the theory said it should, which was an expression of moderate satisfaction rather than triumph. Because Donna had always maintained that satisfaction with a result was proportional to the confidence you had in the method, and her confidence in this method had been significant. "It will hold the packet," Donna said. "I cannot guarantee the transfer speed. Secondary port is an older interface standard. Depending on how old the relay housing is, you may get the full transfer in 15 seconds or it may take as long as 30. 30 seconds is well within the window," Sarah said. "Yes," Donna said. "I just wanted you to know the variable." She knew the variable. She spent the remaining hours before the transition gap loading the data packet. The positional timestamp, the navigation logs, the ship's identification signature, extracted through the commander's authentication code, and a short burst of compressed research data from the Endurance's core, included because Admiral Harmon was going to need to understand who was sending this transmission and what they were doing in this sector. She formatted everything in Earth Command Emergency Burst Protocol, the compressed format she had memorized from the pre-deployment briefing 3 years ago, the format she had been hoping never to need to use. She tested the chip in the terminal 3 times. It held the data cleanly all 3 times. Then she lay down on the sleeping platform and closed her eyes and waited for the transition gap to come. She did not sleep. She had thought she might not be able to sleep, and she was right. But she was not anxious, or she was not primarily anxious. She was in the specific state of heightened attention that precedes a moment that has been prepared for and is about to arrive, a state she had been in many times in her career in different kinds of situations, the state of a system that is fully loaded and waiting for the signal to run. Owen was awake too. She could tell from the quality of his breathing. When the corridor outside went quiet, the specific quality of quiet that she had learned to recognize over 7 days of tracking, the quiet that meant the night watch had ended and the day shift had not yet begun. She got up without a sound, crossed to the ventilation panel, and went in. She had been in the crawl space before. She knew the route: 8 meters horizontal right-angle turn at the junction, a second horizontal run of 20 meters at a slightly downward angle, and then the grate that opened into the aft relay room. She moved through it by feel, counting her arm lengths to track the distance, keeping her movements quiet in the specific way you learn to move quietly in enclosed spaces when noise is not an option. The relay room was empty. The door was sealed from the inside in the maintenance configuration. A passive lock, designed to prevent accidental entry rather than to stop determined access, the kind that an occupied room would switch to an active lock, but that an unoccupied room kept in passive mode to allow authorized maintenance personnel to enter without a key. That distinction was in the maintenance database, and she had flagged it when she read it. It meant the room would not register her entry through the active security system. She crossed to the relay housing in 6 steps and found the secondary data port in the configuration she had seen on the primary array, a small, physical access point in the lower housing section, covered by a removal panel that came off with a quarter turn. She plugged in the chip. She counted in her head. 11 seconds. She pulled the chip, replaced the panel, and was back at the grate before 14 seconds had passed. In the crawl space moving back toward the junction, she allowed herself one thought: it was done. Whatever happened next. Whether the transmission reached a receiver, whether the receiver passed it to Earth Command, whether Earth Command had the resources and the will to act on it. All of that was outside her control now. She had done what she could do. The rest belonged to the transmission, to space, to the 9 hours of lightspeed travel between this ship and the nearest Earth Command relay station. She had learned, over 11 years of fieldwork, to make peace with the boundary between what you could do and what you could not. It was not a comfortable boundary. It did not become comfortable with practice. But you could learn to stand at it without pushing past it, which was its own kind of skill. She counted her arm lengths in the dark and made her way back. The ventilation crawlspace from their new room ran differently than the one in Sarah's first cell. She mapped it on the 6th day, during the 2-hour window in the early morning when corridor activity dropped to its minimum, and the sound outside their door went quiet enough that she could hear her own footsteps. She went in alone, at Donna's insistence, because Donna was the one who had quietly pointed out 3 days earlier that Sarah was the only one of the 4 of them who could read the Cathara text on the access panels inside the ductwork, and a wrong turn in an unfamiliar ventilation system was the kind of problem that did not always have a solution. The crawl space was 60 centimeters in diameter, the same as the first one. The interior was smooth, no rough edges, no projecting hardware, nothing that would catch on clothing or slow movement. It ran horizontally for 8 meters, then opened into a larger junction where 4 other passages met. She could feel the electromagnetic resonance getting stronger as she moved toward the forward section of the ship, the communication array, pulling at the air like a held breath. She found it on the 2nd attempt. The first attempt took her upward 1 deck too many, into what the sound signatures told her was a cargo processing section. Heavy vibration, the mechanical quality of automated sorting systems. Personnel she could hear moving on the far side of the ductwork. She backed out and took the junction branch she had not tried. The second passage ran 43 meters horizontal, passed through a junction where she had to turn sideways and push through a baffling design to regulate airflow, and then terminated at a grate that looked into a room she immediately recognized from the terminal's technical specifications. The communication array. It was larger in person than the schematic had made it seem. The central transmitter housing was nearly 3 meters across, surrounded by a ring of secondary relay components and a horseshoe of control terminals along the far wall. A single Cathara crew member was at one of the terminals, working with the focused efficiency of someone performing a routine task. Sarah watched for 4 minutes through the grate without moving. The crew member did not look up from the terminal. She counted the components, identified the primary transmission interface, a specific terminal configuration she recognized from the signal analysis she had done on Cathara communication broadcasts over the past 8 years. The terminal was staffed now. In the early morning gap it would not be. She also noted something she had not seen in the schematic. A secondary data input port on the underside of the central transmitter housing. A direct physical access point bypassing the control terminals entirely. Older technology, the kind that gets installed during a vessel's original construction, and never removed because removing it would require a rebuild of the surrounding housing, and no one ever builds in time for that kind of project. She had been thinking about how to compress the emergency transmission into 90 seconds. The secondary data port changed the calculation. A direct physical connection would allow her to push a prepared data packet through the array in approximately 15 seconds rather than 90. She would not need to operate the control terminal at all. She backed out of the ductwork the way she had come, counting her turns and recording the route with the care of someone who understood that the return trip in the dark is always more disorienting than the first attempt. She was back in the room before Owen and Ren woke up. Donna was awake. She had been awake when Sarah left, and she was awake when Sarah returned, sitting with her back against the wall and her eyes on the door, with the patient watchfulness of someone who is accustomed to waiting for things that may or may not come back. "It's there," Sarah said quietly. "And there is a direct access port. I can use it." Donna nodded. "The data packet," she said. "You've built it?" "Mostly," Sarah said. "I need 2 more elements. The positional timestamp from the navigation logs, which I already have, and a second component, something that will make an Earth Command receiver treat this as a priority extraction rather than a standard distress signal." "What kind of second component?" Donna said. Sarah looked at her. "The Cathara ship's identification code," she said. "The specific broadcast signature that the ship uses to identify itself to Dominion relay stations. If I include that in the transmission, Earth Command can track the ship, not just know we are aboard it, track it in real time, wherever it goes." Donna was quiet for a moment. "You have those codes?" she said. I have access to the terminal, Sarah said. The identification codes are embedded in the communications subsystem. The access level I reached through the terminal last night is one layer below where those codes live. I need to go one layer deeper. Can you? I need the commander's administrative clearance code, Sarah said, which I do not have, which means I need to obtain it from somewhere other than the terminal. Donna looked at her with the expression she used when she had identified a problem and was waiting for the person with the information to catch up to the implication she had already reached. You are going to ask him for it, she said. He is going to give it to me, Sarah said, not knowingly, but yes. Commander Dreth returned that afternoon. He came again alone. He sat on the same small fixture bolted to the wall and looked at all four of them with his cluster of optical sensors. Moving from face to face with the methodical attention of someone who reads information from faces the way a linguist reads it from text. Sarah watched him do it. She watched the way his attention moved, the order in which he looked at them, the length of time he spent on each person. He spent the most time on her. I have reviewed the navigation logs, he said, the timestamp entry you referenced. And, she said, the Endurance was outside the closed zone boundary at the time of contact, he said. The positional data is consistent with the navigational record from our own sensors, which means the acquisition was outside the parameters of the expansion protocol, she said. The review process for misclassified acquisitions takes 14 Dominion days, he said. During that period, all acquired assets remain in custody. The outcome of the review is determined by the classification board, not by the commander of the acquisition vessel. I understand the process, she said. I read the relevant statute last night. Section 7 of the Outer Sector Acquisition Protocol, amended in the Dominion's fourth expansion period. The 14-day review period includes a mandatory information sharing requirement. The acquired party has the right to submit formal documentation to the classification board, in writing, in their own language. The commander looked at her. You read the acquisition statute, he said. I read everything available on the administrative terminal, she said. I had a long night. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the documentation submission requires commander-level authentication to reach the classification board, through the proper channel. Without that authentication, the submission is logged as informal and carries no procedural weight. She had known this. She had read it in the statute and had built the next 12 hours of her plan around it. I know, she said. I am asking you to provide that authentication. The commander's optical sensors focused on her with an intensity she had been expecting for the past 2 days. Why would I do that, he said. Because the review board is going to find the same thing you found, she said. The positional data is clear. The misclassification will be identified eventually, with or without my submission. The question is whether it is identified with proper documentation that reflects your conduct during the acquisition process, or without that documentation, in a way that leaves the conduct record open to interpretation. She paused for a moment, then said, You came to my interview alone and without a weapon. That is either exceptional competence or exceptional confidence, and based on everything I have observed about this ship and its crew, I believe it is both. You did not make the decision to come alone and unarmed without thinking about it carefully. You made it because you had already assessed the situation and concluded that the conventional approach was wrong. I am asking you to do the same thing again. The commander was very still. She had no way of reading the equivalent of a human expression in the configuration of his optical sensors, but she had been studying non-human attention for 11 years, and she could recognize the quality of engagement in a being that was genuinely thinking. He was thinking. The authentication code for commander-level communications, he said, is a rotating cipher. It changes every 6 hours. I know, she said. I need the current one. If I give it to you, he said, you could use it for purposes other than the documentation submission. Yes, she said. Another silence. Long enough that Owen, standing behind her, shifted his weight. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the commander and waited. What else would you use it for? The commander said. She considered the choice she was facing. It was not a simple one. She could lie, give him a plausible partial truth and extract the code on false pretenses. She was capable of that. She had been in situations in her career where a lie was the correct tool, and she had used it without significant discomfort. But she had been in this room with this being for 15 days now, in the sense that she had been thinking about him and studying him and building a model of how he thought. She had built the model carefully, and the model she had built was one of a person who valued operational honesty. Not moral honesty in an abstract sense, but the practical version of it, the version that says the information I act on needs to be accurate or I will make errors. Lying to someone who values operational accuracy was not just wrong. It was strategically poor. I am going to transmit an emergency burst to Earth Command on their priority extraction frequency, she said. The burst will include our positional data, the ship's identification signature so we can be tracked, and a compressed version of the navigation logs establishing the misclassification. If Earth Command receives that transmission, they will know where we are, and that we are alive, and they will begin the extraction process through whatever channel is appropriate, given the diplomatic situation. The commander looked at her for a long time. You are not asking my permission, he said. I am telling you what I am going to do, she said. There is a difference. I am telling you because I believe you are the kind of officer who makes better decisions with complete information, and I would rather you make your best decision than a worse one. She meant that. She genuinely meant it. If I give you the code, he said, and you use it for this, you are placing me in a position of having facilitated a communication that I am required to prevent. The acquisition was outside the protocol boundary, she said. The communication is consistent with the rights of the acquired party under Section 7. I am not asking you to facilitate anything that is not already authorized by your own legal framework. I am asking you to make the decision your review board is going to make for you anyway. 14 days earlier. The commander was silent for a very long time. Then he said a sequence of 16 characters in Kethera phonetic notation. She memorized all 16 in the time it took him to say them. The transmission window during early morning transition is 16 minutes, he said, not 18. The vibration patterns you have been using to estimate crew movement tend to lag the actual transition by approximately 2 minutes. She stared at him. The ventilation access in this room, he said, routes to the aft communication relay, not the primary array. The aft relay has a lower transmission power, but achieves the same effective range for burst communications with a prepared data packet. He stood up. The secondary data port on the aft relay housing is physically identical to the one on the primary array. You will not need to navigate to the primary array. He walked to the door. Commander, she said. He stopped. Why, she said. He turned his head slightly toward her without turning fully around. Because the acquisition was outside the protocol boundary, he said, and I do not make errors that become visible later. He left. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the space where he had been for a moment. Then she looked at Donna. The aft relay, Donna said. Where is it? One deck down, Sarah said. She was already moving to the ventilation panel. I know exactly where it is. I was just going the wrong direction. She waited until the commander had been gone for 5 minutes before she moved. Not because she was uncertain. She had made her decision about the route the moment he told her, but because moving immediately would have looked like reaction, and she was not reacting. She was executing. The aft relay dawned when Sarah began crossing toward the ventilation panel. I thought you said it was one deck up. I thought it was, Sarah said. The commander corrected me. One deck down. He told you where the relay was, Owen said. He was watching her with the particular quality of attention he used when he was revising his understanding of a situation in real time, the look of a man whose model was being updated against his expectations. He also told me the correct transition window timing and the proper ventilation route, Sarah said. She pulled the panel open. He is a very precise person. He does not like to be wrong in ways that become visible later. She went in. The route down was different from the route up she had been planning for the previous 2 days. She reoriented quickly. The junction 1 deck below was at a 40-degree angle from the junction she had been mapping, and the relay room's position in the lower deck meant the final approach was longer. Nearly 30 meters of horizontal crawl space, rather than the 12 meters she had estimated for the primary array. But the route was clear, and the timing was clear, and the chip in her pocket held the complete data packet, and she moved through the ductwork with the focused economy of movement that comes from preparation meeting execution. The aft relay room was unmanned, as the commander had said. The secondary data port was exactly where she expected it. She plugged in the chip and waited. 11 seconds. The shortest possible transfer at the indicated interface speed. In 11 seconds, 18 months of research data and 2 weeks of hard-earned intelligence was moving through the relay housing and into space, on its way to a receiver 9 light hours away. In 11 seconds, the most consequential thing she had done in her career happened quietly, in a dark room in the lower deck of an alien ship, with no witness but the electromagnetic hum of the relay itself. She pulled the chip and replaced the access panel cover, and was in the crawlspace before 14 seconds had fully elapsed. She counted her way back in the dark. At the junction, she stopped for a moment. The air was moving from the direction of the primary array, 2 decks up. carrying with it the faint electromagnetic signature of the larger system. She thought about the commander standing in their room with his translation device on his knee, asking her about a musical instrument. She thought about the quality of mind that produces that question in that context. Not strategic, not calculated, just genuinely curious about something unexpected. She recognized the quality because she shared it. She continued back toward the room. Behind her, through the relay housing, and through the ship's hull, and through 9 light hours of dark space, a transmission was moving. She did not know what it would produce. She knew what she had sent, and she knew what she hoped it would reach. And she knew that the distance between what you send and what arrives is one of the fundamental uncertainties of communication, the one that every linguist lives with and learns to accommodate. You say what you mean as clearly as you can. You use the best channel available, and then you wait. She had always been patient. It was, if she was honest, one of her better qualities. Owen was awake when she got back. He was sitting in the center of the room with his back straight, and his eyes on the door, and he looked at her when she came out of the ventilation panel with the expression he used when he had been waiting for something he was not certain would come back. Done, she said. 9 hours, he said. Approximately, she said. Depending on relay station positioning. Could be as much as 11. He nodded. He stood up and crossed to the window. There was a window in this room, larger than the viewport in her first cell. A proper rectangular pane that looked out onto a section of the ship's exterior hull and, beyond that, stars. He stood at it and looked out for a moment with the expression of a captain who has been in the water and is finally within sight of shore, not there yet, but able to see where there is. The others, he said, the ones from the other pods. We do not know yet, she said. The transmission will tell Earth Command we are here. Earth Command will look for anyone else. If there are other pods, or other captured crew on this ship or another, they will be part of what gets resolved. He was quiet for a moment. Peter, he said. I know, she said. There was nothing more to say about that. Owen was not a person who needed to be told that uncertainty was difficult, and she was not a person who was going to tell him something comforting that she did not know to be true. They stood in the room together, captain and scientist, and they let the question stay open, because it was open, and the only honest thing to do with an open question was to let it be open. Then Owen said, "What do you think the commander is going to do when the response comes through?" She had been thinking about that. She had several hypotheses, ordered by probability. He is going to divert to a neutral station, she said. He will frame it as consistent with protocol, which it will be, technically, under the misclassification review process. He is a commander who does not like to be wrong in ways that become visible. Diverting to a neutral station to complete the review process correctly will be preferable to him to whatever the alternative is, which is having this situation resolve itself in a way he did not control. You respect him, Owen said. She thought about that. I find him legible, she said, which is rare enough that yes, I think respect is the right word for what that produces in me. Owen looked at her. You have been here for 15 days, he said, and you have built a functional working relationship with the commander of the vessel that captured us. I have been studying his civilization for 8 years, she said. It would be embarrassing if 15 days of direct contact did not produce something useful. Owen almost smiled, almost. The captain part of him was keeping the smile from fully arriving, which was typical of him in situations that had not yet fully resolved. Get some sleep, he said. We have 9 hours. She lay down on the sleeping platform and closed her eyes and was asleep in under 4 minutes, which surprised her. She had thought she would not be able to sleep. But she had done what she could do, and the rest was not within her reach, and her body understood the difference even when her mind was still reviewing the calculation. She slept for 3 hours. When she woke up, Donna was beside her, sitting quietly against the wall, and outside the window the stars were in exactly the same positions they had been 9 hours ago because stars do not move on any scale that 7 hours of sleep makes visible, and the universe does not reorganize itself around the outcomes of human plans. The response came 2 hours later. The aft relay room was smaller than she had expected. Sarah reached it at 4 minutes past the transition gap, moving through the ventilation crawl space 1 deck down from their room with the data packet loaded on a chip she had assembled from 3 separate components borrowed from the room's administrative terminal. A chip that Owen had quietly called impressive, and Donna had called terrifying. The way engineers describe things that work better than the theory predicts they should. The aft relay was unmanned during the transition window, exactly as the commander had said. The secondary data port on the housing was exactly where she expected it, the same configuration as the one she had seen through the grate on the primary array. She plugged in the chip and counted the seconds. 11, not 15. She pulled the chips, closed the port, and was back in the ventilation crawlspace before the 14-second mark. She lay in the crawlspace for a moment after she had sealed the grate behind her. The electromagnetic resonance of the active relay was fading under her feet. The transmission was done. It was in space now, moving at the speed of the signal, heading toward the nearest Earth command receiver in this sector, which based on the navigation logs was approximately 9 hours away at light speed. 9 hours. She would not know for 9 hours whether the transmission had reached anyone. She would not know for longer than that whether anyone had received it clearly enough to act on. She lay in the narrow dark of the ventilation crawlspace, and she thought about Peter Aldrich, who told stories during long transits, and Donna Fraser's laugh that carried through 3 bulkheads, and Captain Owen Cole in the corner of the holding room, with his back against the wall, and his eyes on the ceiling. Then she pulled herself forward and started navigating back toward the room, counting the junctions carefully in the dark. When she got back, Ren was awake. He was sitting on the floor near the door with his arms around his knees, and when she came out of the ventilation panel, he looked at her the way you look at someone returning from somewhere that you were not certain they were going to come back from. "It's done," she said. He nodded. "Now we wait," she said. The next 9 hours were the hardest part of the entire experience, and she could not do anything useful during them. She had done what could be done. The transmission was either going to be received or it was not. Earth Command was either going to respond or they were not. There was no action available to her that would change either of those outcomes. And the discipline of sitting with that fact without flinching was, she had always thought, one of the things that separated people who were genuinely useful in difficult situations from people who were simply busy in them. She slept for 3 of the 9 hours, which surprised her. She had not expected to be able to sleep. But her body made its own decision, and when she woke up, Donna was sitting beside her in the same position she had been in when Sarah closed her eyes, as though she had decided that staying in one place while Sarah slept was a thing worth doing. "Anything?" Sarah said. "Nothing visible," Donna said. The response came 11 hours after the transmission, not 9, and it did not come the way she had expected. She had anticipated a communication from Earth Command, a signal through the relay, a message, something that would tell her the transmission had been received and was being acted on. What she got instead was Commander Dreth, arriving at their room for the 3rd time, alone, without his translation device, and standing in the doorway looking at her with the quality of attention she had come to associate with him, receiving information he had not expected. "A Dominion Outer Sector Relay Station has intercepted a response transmission on the Earth Command emergency frequency," he said. The response was addressed to a vessel designated Endurance, crew of 12, acquired by 7th Acquisition's vessel Koreth Nam. He paused. "The response includes navigational data for this vessel's current position, and a priority extraction acknowledgement from an Earth Command senior logistics officer named Admiral Claire Harmon." Sarah sat completely still. "They received it," she said. "They received it," he said. Admiral Harmon's response indicates that Earth Command is dispatching a diplomatic representative to the nearest neutral transit station with legal standing in outer sector disputes. She requests that the Koreth Nam divert to that station pending resolution of the acquisition status question. He paused again. She also notes that the transmission included 18 months of scientific research data and asks that the research team be permitted to continue their work during the transit on the grounds that an interruption to an active longitudinal study would represent irreplaceable data loss. Sarah looked at him. "Admiral Harmon sounds like someone who reads acquisition law carefully," the commander said. "She does," Sarah said. "I have worked with her before. She is extremely thorough." The transit to the neutral station took 6 days. Commander Dreth gave them access to a larger section of the ship during the transit. Not unrestricted, not freedom, but a meaningful expansion of the space they were allowed to occupy. Ren spent most of the 6 days in the section of the ship where the Endurance had been docked, working with the Cathara engineering team to confirm that the ship's systems had not been damaged during the acquisition. Donna helped him. Owen walked the corridors in the careful, deliberate way he walked when he was thinking through something complicated. Sarah spent 4 of the 6 days in formal conversations with Commander Dreth. They were extraordinary conversations. She had spent 8 years studying Cathara language and culture from the outside, through intercepted signals and translated documents, and the second-hand accounts of the 3 non-human species that had survived meaningful contact with the Dominion and been willing to share what they knew. She had built a detailed picture of the Cathara from that material, Their social structure, their communication patterns, their legal frameworks, their expansion logic, the specific way they organized the universe into categories of things that belonged to them and things that did not yet belong to them. The picture was accurate in its broad strokes. In its specific details, it was wrong in more ways than she could count. Commander Dreth corrected her, patiently and systematically, over the 4 days of conversation, sometimes with exasperation, and sometimes with what she was increasingly certain was something close to amusement, though she could not yet read his equivalent of amusement with any confidence. She corrected her picture. She asked questions. He answered them, with the directness of someone who had grown up in a culture where asking a direct question and receiving a direct answer was considered the most efficient form of communication available. On the 3rd day of the transit, she asked him why he had given her the authentication code. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The acquisition was a misclassification. I knew it from the first review. The boundary data was clear. You could have held the review for 14 days regardless," she said. "The protocol allows it. The protocol allows many things," he said. "Allowing a thing and doing it are not the same decision." She looked at him. "When I arrived here," she said, "you told your crew to place me in the holding room. You laughed when I said I did not use weapons." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He was quiet again. The quality of his silence was one she had been learning to read over the past 2 weeks. This particular one was the silence of choosing between 2 versions of an answer. "Because I expected you to be afraid," he said. "Every acquisition we have made, every crew member from every vessel, is afraid. It is the correct response to the situation. You were not afraid." He paused, interested. "You looked at the room as though it was a problem you were looking forward to solving." "It was a problem I was looking forward to solving," she said. "Yes," he said. "I understood that approximately 3 minutes after the interview, which is when I decided that the conventional approach was wrong." She thought about that, about the gap between what she had expected, fear, compliance, the standard transaction of power, and what had actually happened, which was 2 people in a room finding out that the situation between them was more complicated than either had walked in expecting. She thought about how often that gap exists in any encounter between 2 things that are genuinely trying to understand each other rather than simply to prevail. "The Dominion," she said. "The expansion protocol, the acquisition framework. How long has it been running?" 400 years, he said. "And in 400 years," she said, "has it ever gone in a different direction?" The commander looked at her. "No," he said. "Has it ever been asked to?" she said, a long pause. "Not by someone I was inclined to take seriously," he said. She held his gaze and said nothing. She let the silence do the work that silence does when both people in it are intelligent enough to understand what is not being said. The neutral station appeared on the horizon of the viewport 6 days after the transmission, a curved structure of docking arms and pressurized modules that looked, from a distance, like a child's drawing of a space station and, up close, like something that had been added to and modified and repaired so many times over so many years by so many different species that it had stopped looking like any one thing and started looking like a record of everyone who had ever needed a place to stop. Admiral Claire Harmon was already there. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with short gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years in positions that required her to be the calmest person in any room she entered. She met them in the station's primary docking corridor, accompanied by 2 diplomatic staff members and a legal officer who carried a case that was clearly full of documents. She looked at Sarah first, then at Owen, Donna, and Wren, then at Commander Dreth standing 3 meters behind them. "Commander Dreth," she said, "I have read your acquisition log. You acted with unusual restraint under the circumstances." "The circumstances were unusual," the commander said. Harmon looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I believe they were." The formal resolution took 2 days. The legal framework was clear, the positional data, the navigation logs, the Endurance's proper classification, and the classification board reviewing Commander Dreth's acquisition log found in favor of misclassification within 18 hours of receiving the submission. The Endurance and its crew were released to Earth Command custody. The research data was confirmed as the property of the research team. The 18 months of longitudinal study were intact. Sarah sat in the station's observation bay on the 2nd day, while the formal documentation was being processed, watching the stars through a viewport that had a crack in the lower left corner. Sealed, with an application of epoxy that had bubbled slightly during the repair. She had her wristwatch on her left wrist. The second hand made its steady circle. Owen came and sat beside her after a while. "You knew he was going to help you," Owen said. "It was not quite a question." I thought it was likely, she said. I was not certain. I was acting on a model I had built from 2 weeks of observation, and the model was either accurate or it was not. What if it had not been? She was quiet for a moment. Then I would have found a different approach, she said. There was always a different approach. The first approach is always the one that works with the situation as it is. If the situation had been different, the approach would have needed to be different. That is a very calm way to describe being captured by an alien fleet, he said. I was not calm, she said. I was focused. The two things feel similar from the outside, but they come from different places. Being calm is about emotion. Being focused is about where you are putting your attention. I put my attention on what I could do, rather than on what had already happened. She paused. My grandmother told me that once. She was a very practical person. Owen nodded slowly. He was quiet for a while, looking out the same viewport at the same stars. Ren, he said finally. He held together. He did, Sarah said. Better than most people would have. He is going to be very good eventually. He already is, Owen said. He just does not know it yet. She thought about that. About the gap between what you are and what you know yourself to be, and how often that gap stays open longer than it needs to. Not because the evidence is unavailable, but because looking at it directly requires a specific kind of courage that has nothing to do with bravery in any conventional sense. Admiral Harmon appeared in the doorway of the observation bay. She was carrying a data tablet and had the focused, slightly distracted expression of someone whose mind is 3 steps ahead of the conversation they are about to have. The release documentation is signed, she said. The Endurance is ready for departure as soon as the crew is assembled. She paused. Sarah, a moment. Harmon came in and sat where he had been. Commander Dreth's acquisition log includes a notation. Harmon said, he flagged your conversations during the transit as, and I am quoting here, an exceptionally productive exchange of operational information with a clear mutual benefit outcome. That is a very Kethera way of describing a conversation, Sarah said. It is, Harmon said. He also requested formally, through the station's diplomatic registry, that your contact information be made available to him through official channels. She held up the data tablet. He has submitted a proposal for a structured information exchange between the Kareth Nam and the Endurance. Not a treaty, not a formal diplomatic agreement, a structured exchange. His proposed terms are detailed, specific, and show a thorough understanding of Earth Command's research protocols, which he apparently obtained from the Endurance's public registry documentation. Sarah looked at the tablet. He read our public registry documentation, she said. During the transit, apparently, Harmon said. He is very thorough. Sarah was quiet for a moment. She looked out the viewport at the stars, at the crack in the lower left corner of the glass with its slightly bubbled epoxy repair, at the small steady light of a star she did not know the name of, holding its position at the exact center of the crack, framed by the imperfect repair like a picture hung with more care than its setting deserved. A structured exchange, she said. Meaning an ongoing relationship. Meaning an ongoing relationship, Harmon said. Subject to Earth Command review, of course, and to whatever conditions you consider appropriate, given your direct knowledge of the situation. Sarah thought about the commander. Arriving alone and without a weapon. Arriving a second time alone and without a weapon, and asking about a musical instrument. Giving her an authentication code, and the correct ventilation route, and the accurate transition window timing, and calling it a question of operational accuracy. Tell him yes, she said, subject to Earth Command review, and tell him, she paused. Tell him that I am still not very good at the cello, but that the process of learning something difficult is worth more than the result. He will understand what I mean. Harmon looked at her for a moment. I will include that in the formal response, she said, in the tone of someone who had seen many unusual things in 30 years of service, and had made peace with seeing more. She left. Sarah stayed in the observation bay for another hour, watching the star at the center of the cracked viewport, listening to the tick of her watch, thinking about language and patience, and the specific quality of attention that is required to understand something you have never encountered before. 8 years studying a civilization from the outside, 2 weeks inside it. There was no comparison. She had learned more in those 2 weeks, about the Kethera, about the structure of their law, and the logic of their expansion and the specific way their most senior officers made decisions under conditions of genuine uncertainty, than she had in 8 years of signal analysis. Not because the 8 years were wasted, because they were not. The 8 years gave her the framework to understand what she was experiencing when she was inside it. But the difference between knowing a thing from the outside and understanding it from the inside was the difference between a map And a terrain. She had been in the terrain now. And the terrain was, in all the ways that mattered, more interesting than any map had led her to expect. She wound her watch and stood up. The Endurance was waiting. The crew was assembling. 18 months of research data was intact in the data core, plus 2 weeks of notes she had made in her head during the transit that were going to require a very long debrief to fully record. She had a structured exchange proposal to review, a report to write for the Full Earth Command Scientific Directorate, and a paper to begin drafting on Cathara administrative law that she was fairly certain would require completely revising the existing academic framework. There was, as always, a great deal of work to do. She left the observation bay and walked toward the docking arm where the Endurance was waiting, counting her steps on the way, noting the composition of the floor material, observing the way the station's lighting shifted between sections, paying attention to everything. She always did.